Great, thank you very much. Can you all hear me from the mic on my shirt? Awesome, very good, thank you. Again, as introduced, my name is Ron Dodge. I've been at Palo Alto Networks for about three and a half years. And this talk isn't necessarily about Palo Alto Networks. In fact, it's not at all. It's about the job I get to do at Palo Alto Networks, which is lead our security engineering team. My responsibilities there include securing all of our corporate enterprise, as well as all of our product and customer-facing infrastructure. As part of that mission, I reside within our larger InfoSec organization that involves architecture, engineering, governance, risk and compliance, and security operations. My biggest customer from a security engineering perspective is, that's a little loud there, is the SOC, our Security Operations Center. They are the #1 customer for me when it comes to the technologies I deploy or the way we go about solving problems. So the talk today is about how we leverage their opportunities to reduce the amount of threats and alerts that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and really focus on the high fidelity, high risk events that are much harder to identify. So we leverage a suite of different capabilities in order to do that. I'm happy to go into depth in any of those that you'd like. During the discussion, please raise your hand and we'll just take your questions as we go through it. I only have 2 PowerPoint slides that actually have bullets on them, I promise. So most of it's pictures and talking about the infrastructure and the processes we have in place. There we go. So as I'm sure most all of you understand from the security mission, just how complex that job is day in and day out. So this is a little bit of a modification of either the attack lifecycle or the kill chain or whatever you want to call it. This was put together by part of actually Palo Alto Networks, an organization called Unit 42, which is our kind of public-facing research organization. And it looks at try to build what's called a playbook, but not for a security operations center, but the playbook of an adversary. So if an adversary is going to do something, what is it that they do? And they map it across all the major campaigns out there. And so across from credentialed access to execution, privileged execution, discovery, collection, command and control, I just named a few of them, they've mapped out a lot of the major campaigns that are ongoing. So for example, for Lazarus, what they looked at all the different aspects that were listed up there that take part within the Lazarus campaign. And specifically, they map out a couple different attacks. So this is part of the playbook for Lazarus, where it started off with spear phishing, which had the user do something malicious unknowingly on their box, which then led to depositing hidden files on the endpoint, doing privileged execution on the endpoint, starting to look across the network, dumping credentials on devices they found, moving laterally in the environment, to finally getting to the point where they exfil data out over a known service port, like whatever it is, 53, 22, depending upon what your organization allows. So if you're curious about the playbook, it's actually really cool. You can just Google Unit 42 playbook, and it'll pop up, or you can use that link on the slide. It's a pretty neat tool to play with. But really, the talk is about the complexity of what I just showed you, all those different things that SOCs need to be aware of and track. And not just what the adversary does, but the entire suite of tools that are out there on the things that you could be leveraging within your SOC to reduce the risk for your organization, find where the compromises are. Lots of different tools. So it's hard to find SOC people that know how to leverage every tool you have in your suite. So this is where multiple different tools come into play that help us not only synthesize that entire big matrix we showed up earlier of all the different things bad guys, gals can do in your environment, but also help you leverage the tools that are there in a manner that frees up your SOC guys to really, guys and gals to focus on really, again, the high fidelity stuff. And that's really about SOAR. So security, orchestration, automation, response. There's 2 things that I borrowed this from Gartner, for just make note. There are two things on the slide, though, that are typically the things that get looked over. The first one is, automation is not about doing everything automated. Usually human response is always part of a majority of what you end up doing. And then secondly, at the end of the day, what we're solving for is risk. And so just because you can automate something, you really need to do a risk analysis to make sure that the problem you're solving is the right problem for the business, not just implementing tools. So those are very important, at least in my mind, when I go to deploying tools to help our SOC or processes. So common within our SOC and likely within the organizations you all represent, there are a lot of drivers about why we have implemented orchestration and automation within our Security Operations Center to support the mission. The first one, it isn't necessarily a staff shortage, although we could always use more keys on the keyboard, more hands on the keyboard. Really, it's about the second one, which is just so much work for the people that you have that it's really not even scalable anymore to solve the alert and the security problem just by staffing up. You need to find better ways to do it. Our founder, a guy named Nir Zook, often talks about the fact that the threat is no longer a human threat, it's an automated threat. And you can't fight a software automated threat with people. You can't. You have to do the same exact thing, which is bring software and automation to this adversary and to the fight that we're all in. The threats are also becoming more destructive. They're getting more complex. They can hide in your environment much better. And going back to that suite of security tools, that was just security tools that I showed. Now think about all the different tools. So we probably have 15 or 16 different security tools that are critical for us in our mission. I've got 180 that are just using our SSO from a business application alone. And that's probably only half of them because I can only get half of the business units to, or actually, I can only get the business units to pony up about half the applications that they're using. But so the complexity of our environment, beyond just the security tools, is also what the business partners bring to the table. And this is the second bullet slide, no more after this one. So how do we solve for that? Well, we've taken an automation approach against it, and again, following this acronym of SOAR, the first thing is orchestration. Now, I don't know if folks have a background in this, but a lot of people, when we talk about SOAR, they look at orchestration and automation, and they're really unclear of what the difference is between the two. So in my mind, orchestration is about the ability to reach out to multiple different capabilities within your environment, usually tools, to make a change, to either collect information, to implement some sort of remediation action. So it's that orchestration part where you have the ability to touch things in your environment, lots of different things. Automation is the decision workflow around that. Just because I can do it, okay, great. That doesn't really help me in an automation environment because you're not telling me what to do. What are the decision criteria? What are the parameters that I want to tweak, and how do I tweak them? What are the metrics around either putting something in a quarantine zone, knocking it off the network completely, enforcing multi-factor authentication on anomalous activity, behavior, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of automation that requires, if you're familiar with the flow chart, that diamond symbol of a decision that has to get made. That's what automation, at least the way that we've implemented it, are. The third part about a SOAR capability is now to record all that information, enable the collaboration amongst all the people in the SOC or in your engineering or infrastructure teams, have something that they can use to collate all that information, have it presented to them in a easy to see, easy to navigate through environment, and make sure that everything that's done is documented. One of the first kind of pillars of our automation and orchestration program is thou shalt not change anything unless it's documented in a ticket. And that's not a thou as a person, it's thou in the general sense of anything, process, whatever it may happen to be. You don't change anything until it's been documented that it's been done. And then lastly, dashboard and reporting. One of the things that security people are usually not really good about is cleaning up after the fact and doing metrics around what it is that they've done and how effective it is. You'll see later on in the slide, one of the things that we do is I've got a 90% false positive metric on my automation. If I have an automated workflow where I get false positives or I guess true positives that fall below 90%, we pull it. We don't leverage that for an automation anymore until we fix it. We figure out why it's not being as accurate as we want, and then implement it back in an automated workflow once we get it going. So any questions on those two slides? Yeah, let's keep driving forward. So your SOAR platform, whatever it may happen to be, could be a single platform, a swim lane, a Demisto, a Phantom, simpler. There's several of them out there. It can be awesome, like the Ferrari or the Jaguar in the picture, but if you take it and you put it in the wrong environment, like off-road, it's really not going to work really well. I know many people are looking at the slides going, what's a car going to do about SOAR? It's really about the misplacement of a really good system in an environment where it's not going to work really well. And so some of the things that we work really hard at doing is making sure that those 3 points are very well maintained. So first is we want visibility throughout the entire environment. Because if you don't have complete data for your SOAR implementation, bad data in, probably a bad decision on the other side. Making sure that if we do find something, that we've got one of those triangles that say do something, or the diamonds that say do something, that we have the ability to enforce throughout our infrastructure that particular change. And then lastly, which is the orchestration part, make sure that we can actually talk to everything. A lot of different platforms come with different APIs for different integrations. Make sure that the data type and the data definition across all those platforms is normalized. So when our SOAR platform is starting to do something, like Palo Alto Networks platform, one of the things we're really good about from a mission perspective is using user ID. So not caring about the IP address of the device on your infrastructure, but really it's about the user on that device. If you don't have consistent recognition of user ID, so for instance, we've recently integrated an Aruba capability in with our platform for user ID, but Aruba presented that user ID string in a format that our infrastructure didn't recognize. So again, we had to go in and normalize that to make sure that all of the different pieces of that infrastructure that you have, that they all understand what a user ID format looks like commonly. So a couple examples of this visibility. So not only within our own normal on-prem infrastructure do we want to see where all of our devices are and what they're communicating, we also want to do that for all of our remote users. Palo Alto Networks, much like probably a lot of your organizations, we're half remote. Half of our 6,000 employees work not associated with a typical branch office. So we want to make sure, even me, I've been on the road for 3 days and haven't been on a branch LAN connection at all. Everything is through our VPN solution. So we want to make sure that even those clients that are out doing everybody's good work out on the road have the same kinds of protections. Something else we also look at, though, is, again, going back to that visibility piece, if you allow your users to disable that VPN connection, so for us, the VPN connection is called always on. You boot up your laptop, it automatically connects. However, we all know that we're on airplanes. We may be working in sensitive environments. My background was 30 years in the Department of Defense, so Lord knows I've spent lots of times in places where I can't have a network connection or can't go through somebody else's VPN. So we let our users disable VPN if they have to, so they can get their job done. But I also monitor that. So a couple controls, we have it automatically turn on in 2 hours. They can go back and disable it again, but it's kind of making it a pain for them to do so. And the second one is monitor who actually is doing it and how often they do it, so that if we see something really out of the normal, we can go in and say, visibility is important to us, going back to that slide. We really need to find out why it is that you keep disabling VPN access. And one of the reasons, not surprising probably to a lot of you who deal with IT infrastructure, 2 years ago, so we recently launched out a capability to deploy out our VPN solution, Global Protect, into AWS and Azure and GCP, so it could be in the cloud where the users are. So we had a large collection of those users that kept disabling GP were geographically really remote. And so, for instance, they were in Sao Paulo, and their closest VPN concentrator was Southern California, which just didn't really make sense for them. So by enabling better infrastructure, we were able to go in and greatly reduce the number of folks that were jumping off of that VPN connection. And then, so why do we want to see them? Well, we want to see the traffic because there's lots of malware. However, one of the other capabilities that should be implemented to support a SOAR program is SSL Decryption. Just because they're on the VPN doesn't mean you're actually seeing what the traffic is. 80% of our network traffic that's egressing out to the internet, either through a VPN gateway and back out or straight from a corporate presence, 80% of it's encrypted, which means that you won't see any of that 80% traffic. When we implemented SSL Decrypt about 2.5 years ago, corporate-wide, we saw an order of magnitudes, like 100 times the number of alerts that we weren't seeing before. Just think about it, 80% of your traffic is blind, so that kind of makes sense. You're going to see a lot more alerts. So visibility, just because you've got people on a VPN or just because you've got them on the network and you're capturing that traffic as they egress out, if it's not decrypted, it's really not helping you a whole lot other than real fundamental type analysis. And we'll save this one for later. If anybody wants to know how SSL Decrypt works, we can go into that at some point in time. So now to the other part of automation, or of why we want to do actually automation now, is because just alerting isn't good enough. What we really want to do is we want to know that somebody broke in, and then we want to take immediate action to remediate any sort of risk that was just introduced by this unknown entity in your environment. So rather than a burglar alarm, have an automatic locking door where when that alarm goes off, you lock the door immediately so you quarantine that threat to right where you heard the alarm, protecting the crown jewels. So going back to the slide we showed earlier, we want to have enforcement points wherever that may happen to be, because obviously, you know, the burglar alarm and the safe, take that and just transplant that metaphor onto an endpoint, right? Quarantine a process as an example. So we want to be able to enforce whether it's quarantining or dropping a box off the network completely, or again, as I described earlier, enforcing MFA. So within Palo Alto Networks, I want to go through a little bit of some of the things that we've implemented from a security perspective to support our SOAR mission. So we're about 6,000 employees, 20,000 or so endpoints, 13 different data centers, about 50,000 unique customers that interact with our customer-facing infrastructure all the time. And when I first came to Palo Alto Networks, everything was automated. And so you can imagine that even the most mundane and simple tasks that were really low-hanging fruit consumed our SOC day in and day out because there's just so much of them. So our goal is to take that and of all those alerts that we see in our environment, automate the response on as much as we possibly can, thereby letting our SOC folks, guys and gals, engage in that looking for the really high risk and things within our environment. And we do that through a 4-step process. Not surprising, I've talked about these things for the last 20 minutes, which is visibility, reducing the attack surface by making sure that we have our folks on VPN, that we have visibility into what they're doing. We prevent known threats, and this is part of that automation, whether it's on our platform or whether it's on an endpoint. Just don't let it happen if you can. And then preventing unknown threats, which is really kind of, it's not Palo Alto Networks specific, but very much so looking at unknown threats to your environment that may be known somewhere else, or from an endpoint perspective, rather than doing typical antivirus of looking at the hash of a file and saying we think that one's bad because we saw it someplace else, actually monitoring process execution. And when the process execution is doing something that isn't good, and there's only like 28, 29, 30 ways that you can pop a process, right, on an x86 architecture. So why not just watch for those things, and when you see that occurring, say, I don't care what the file hash is because it could have been modified 2 seconds ago. The fact that it's doing something malicious is what I care about. So preventing those threats you really don't even know about just by watching what's going on. So this is where our SOC tries to operate. So on the left-hand side and kind of top, that's the stuff we try to automate through our SOAR program. We want to look at reconnaissance, we want to look at weapons delivery, we want to look at exploitation installation, and we want to solve that through automation. We just want to stop it or alert it and then implement some sort of automated response from a quarantining or implement multi-factor authentication if we think it's a credential abuse. And then as you go to the right, that's where it becomes more complicated and harder to automate, which is why we pay our SOC folks to come in and actually look for this stuff day in and day out. And as I described earlier, our goal is to let the SOC spend 50% of their time actually digging in and doing hunting rather than going to the ServiceNow ticket queue and just taking them off the top of the queue and trying to mitigate all the low-hanging fruit that they see. And as I described earlier, if we get some of those alerts that keep hitting that 90% or so threshold, then we pull it out of the workflow and we figure out why it's doing that so that we can raise that fidelity back up. And that's my commitment to our SOC team, that I won't write them an automated workflow that's going to continue to not deliver for them. So, real example. So about 2 years ago when we first started down this journey, we use Phantom internally to help with our automation. And we've looked at all of them, and Phantom is what we use today. Doesn't mean we'll be on Phantom tomorrow. Right now it serves our purpose. We started off that my tools team, my developers team, they built all of our automation and orchestration. We've actually worked it so that we've transitioned to probably up to 75% of our automation work is actually done by our SOC team by using the capabilities within the Phantom tool and the education in how to develop within that environment. But so we took a very simple example about 2 years ago, and we said, let's talk about phishing. Right? A user gets a phishing email. It takes our SOC team about 45 minutes to go through all the things they would do if they were to review an email that somebody submitted to our spoof inbox. So we have an email alias called spoof@paloaltonetworks.com. Employee, if they think they got a phishing email, they just forward it to spoof@paloaltonetworks.com. Before, we had a person or a team monitoring that inbox. They'd take it, and then they would just manually go through the process of remediation. Typical things in a remediation has an attachment. You download it, and you send it off to whatever sort of sandbox tool you want. In our platform, we send it to VirusTotal, and we send it to Wildfire, which is the Palo Alto Networks Threat Analytics Cloud platform, for analysis. And then if one comes back as positive, one comes back as negative, or if they both come back as positive, that kicks off different parts of the workflow. If it's got a URL in it, we take the URL and we go farm it out to tools that go out and scrape pages to look for malicious content. Look at domain name reputation services. Look in repositories for where internet history information lives. So we go through that entire process, and it takes about 45 minutes from start to finish for that analyst to do it. This is kind of what all that process looks like in Phantom. This is the Phantom IDE, essentially. And, oh, by the way, some of the times, if the SOC person got through that and they said, oh, this isn't malicious, they just go on to the next one. They don't document what they did because it's not worth it. It's not malicious, so why am I going to spend more time documenting what I just did? So part of this process within the automation is it automatically creates that ticket. Once the verdict comes back from VirusTotal or from Wildfire, it updates the ticket with that verdict. From the reputation service, it updates the ticket. So all that information is there. And so at the end of this workflow, 47 minutes is what it takes an analyst. But really, it takes about 3 or 4 minutes when you throw automation at it. And if it comes back to the point where it's not, the verdict says it's not benign, it's something that's of interest to us, depending upon how confident we are in exactly what it was. So for instance, it came back with a known bad hash. Wildfire already knows about that file, or Wildfire didn't know about that file, but it comes back as malicious. We then can take automated remediation with some of our other infrastructure. So from a host interrogation perspective, we use a tool called Tanium, and we'll just kick off a process as part of that automated workflow that says, you know what, I know this file is malicious. There's no reason why it should stay on that endpoint. So just go remove it. Now we take it, we don't delete it and throw it off into the ether and never see it again. We hold it as part of that process, document it so that if the user comes back and says, wait, I'm a malware researcher, I really needed that file, we can recover it for for that individual so they can get back to doing what their job is. But really what we do is at the end of that 3 or 4 minutes, you just present that back to the SOC analyst and say, hey, here's an output of the workflow, benign, don't worry about it, or we took these actions. You might want to follow up depending upon what your playbook says. So greatly reduces what the SOC analyst has to do. And notice, they're only doing something when something comes back as confirmed. If it's benign, they never even see it, except when we go back to that last point that I mentioned from a SOAR, which is dashboarding and reporting. We certainly want to know how many times we got kicked off with a benign result or a benign verdict on one of these workflows. So phishing as an example. So a little bit about our infrastructure in how we go about doing this. Remember I said number one, visibility is very important, and it's not just visibility from a watching network traffic flow across your environment. It's also about going onto the endpoint and making sure you're collecting the right kind of logs off that endpoint. So whether it's from an enterprise perspective, we have several tools that we use, both from a data collection and a remediation perspective. Network. Those are pretty common. Firewall appliances or Global Protect gateways. Our endpoint. So on our endpoint, we leverage our own endpoint protection capability called Traps. We're actually moving into, we did an acquisition of a company called SecDo about 6 or 7 months ago, and that's going to be rolled out as a capability called XDR very soon, which allows us to actually, Traps is really good about monitoring what's going on in the process land on a system to look for malicious activity, but it's not really good about reaching out to the endpoint to go do something about it other than block it. You know, there's lots of things you might want to do as a follow-up when Traps reports that it found a malicious process. XDR is going to come onto this slide next month, actually, when it is production. And then lastly, over on the cloud side, all those events are logged up into a couple different environments. Palo Alto Networks has a logging capability called Logging Service, where we push our logs so that we can do some additional analytics up there. But we also then take that, and on the left-hand side, we put it into a Splunk infrastructure, where really it's the heart of where the orchestration program starts. Everything gets into there, and then all the capabilities that we leverage are typically built out of alerts that we've created within Splunk. So we see something in Splunk, it sends an alert to Phantom. Phantom then kicks off the rest of the workflow for that. We do have a couple different though, so you notice on Splunk it goes up to the left for Phantom and to the right for long-term storage. We do leverage some other types of analytics with a Hadoop cluster with Spark on that we look at things that Splunk doesn't do really well, but they're kind of aside from what we normally do from our SOAR program. Our SOAR program is really focused around, you know, the billions of alerts we get to go remediate those so that the SOC doesn't spend their entire time tracking those down. Example of what that one of those workflows looks like. So Splunk will go into Phantom will recognize an alert from Splunk. Phantom will then do lots of different things on the right-hand side. As I mentioned, we leverage a lot of capabilities, some of our own platform, some of them just open source security capabilities that are out there, some we pay for. It kicks off a couple things. It kicks off the ServiceNow ticket, which is the source of truth for everything we've always done. And then Jira is what we use to actually monitor and enforce, making sure people are actually following up on the tasks that need to get accomplished. And so that's all done by Phantom. I don't have a project manager or a PM person sitting in the SOC going, okay, what's next? Let me create a Jira ticket for that. It's just done automatically, which, well, I'll tell you what, our visibility, not into the environment, but our visibility, what our SOC team was doing, rose immensely because they just didn't have to do that manual labor anymore. And I was probably the worst about it when I was in a SOC. So these are the different capabilities we have across our environment that we leverage. I've already talked to a couple of them. You know, we look at Okta for anomalous login activities. We actually have a little bit of a adaptive MFA implementation that, as I described earlier, if we see anomalous login activity, we could just expire all tokens and say, user, you have to re-authenticate again. And oh, by the way, you're going to have to do multi-factor this time because we don't trust you anymore. And so then probably one of the last things, well, actually the last thing from a presentation perspective to talk about, we talked about visibility into your environment, making sure that just because you've got the slickest tool in a SOAR, that if you don't understand your environment, if you don't get the data from your environment, if it's used in the wrong place, it's not going to do any good for you. I wanted to extend that also a little bit. This is not complete. It's a program we kicked off about 3 months ago, and it's an endpoint visibility and agent correlation. So we talked about traps a little bit ago, which is our endpoint capability. I don't know that traps is working. It's on my laptop. Process could be running, but really at the end of the day, if it's not talking to our traps management console, TMS, what good is it? Because my laptop's not talking to Splunk. TMS is talking to Splunk. And so how do I make sure that all of my endpoint tools are doing the reporting and that we have the visibility for those as well? So what we did is we looked across all of the different security capabilities, and some of them aren't even security. You could argue SCCM is security, but it's really IT management. But look at all the different capabilities that can see an endpoint. And just ask each one all the time. Hey, when was the last time you saw this host name? What was its current IP address? And then just do that continuously throughout the day globally. And now you get this picture of, wait, hold on, 7 of these endpoint capabilities are reporting correctly, but the 8th capability doesn't even know it exists. So obviously, that capability is down. Let's say it's a server, and Splunk is no longer receiving logs from that server. That's a bad thing. And so to be able to see that, because you can't ask Splunk, well, I guess you kind of can, but it's hard to say, tell me when this system is no longer reporting, or tell me when somebody stood up a brand new server and the heavy forwarder didn't get installed correctly, or syslog wasn't configured. That's kind of impossible without correlation. And so that understanding of your environment, it really goes down to the endpoint as well, server or laptop. So that was the last one about the way we've implemented SOAR, some of our program objectives. And so if you have any questions about either the tools we use or the processes or any of the workflows, please feel free. Going twice? Okay, well, great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. Take care.